Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you. Hope you all had a nice fall break. I think for some of you, this is not your first session to come to the Asian Studies Symposium, and that's great. You should have been at every one of them. They've been great. So, and let me just tell you, come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Dr. Dunscombe, who's going to be making our presentation this evening, we'll be talking about the crisis in Japanese baseball. Now listen, let me tell you, this is not exactly what you think it's going to be. Okay, so it's going to be very cool and interesting. So 10 o'clock in this place and so forth, but we're glad to have you here this evening. And I'm especially pleased to introduce Dr. Paul Dunscombe, who is a professor of history at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. So if you want to know anything about Alaska, Anchorage, moose, bear, whatever, glaciers. He's your man, okay? He's your man. But Dr. Dunscombe, his specialty is East Asia. He's just published recently very important work called Japan Since 1945. It's a work in the Key Issues series of the International Association of Asian Studies. And this is like a bunch of really high-burning scholars, right? So we've got the guy who's just published in that series with us this evening, and you'll have a great time getting to know him. This evening he's going to be talking about Japan's pursuit of human-form robots, and there's no way that anybody will be able to follow this act this evening, I can tell you. But I'm so pleased that he accepted our invitation, and so please, let's give him a nice warm Belmont welcome.
So thanks very much to Ronnie for having me come out here. Also thanks to Cindy, who had me in her samurai class, I think, Andrea Stover, John Payne, all the rest of the crew here at Belmont for their hard work setting up this symposium and giving over to me 2 generous blocks of time to talk a couple of wildly divergent projects that I'm currently working on. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming out for tonight's session. So, not to give away what's going to happen tomorrow, but kind of spoiler alert, this is one of the things that we're kind of wrapping up our conclusions on the crisis in Japanese professional baseball of 2004. One of the things it tells us is a little bit about the narrative of change that's taken place in Japan during the Heisei period, that is the reign of the current emperor. And basically the story of Heisei Japan is incremental change. And yet, even incremental change can add up over time. So this has been a very important part of the fact that people have wanted Japan to do more, to change more, to act more boldly in the face of its various crises and whatnot. And yet, things have actually changed a lot. But of course, Japan also has a history of major discontinuities. The Meiji Revolution, to start with. From 1868, the transformation of Japan into the first non-Western modern nation state, done entirely through its own efforts. Scholars argue a bit more about this, just how much of a discontinuity it marks, and yet there is no denying the fact that Japan, after the US occupation in 1952, is a very different place than it was in the early 1940s. So yet another major change taking place in Japan. And there is presently, for the fact that all this incremental change really is the theme of Japan these days, there is presently another possibility for out-of-left-field change in Japan. Now, back in 2006, I was asked to speak as part of a panel at the UAA bookstore on the latest developments in artificial intelligence, and I was called by the organizer because, as a Japan expert, I knew all about robots, right? That might say something about the people at the bookstore. It definitely, I think, says something about Japan. The fact that because I know about Japan, I must know about robots. Well, actually not really at the time, but I'm always up for a challenge, so I agreed to speak. And it was a life-altering event for several reasons, among them propelling me yet another step down this road to becoming a historian of the Heisei period, but also the most significant thing which I came away with from my experience on that panel was the sudden and slightly terrifying realization that when the day ever came that machines arose to supplant human beings as the planet's dominant species, our new machine overlords were going to be in the form of Hello Kitty robots. Now, Before going any further, I need to acknowledge an intellectual debt to Jennifer Robertson. Like I said, I do this as kind of a side thing. Jennifer Robertson, who is professor of anthropology and history of art at University of Michigan, this is her field. This is what she really does. She's gone a great deal of work on robots in Japan and has been brave enough to explore precisely how deep the rabbit hole goes. Her book is coming out next spring, Robo Sapiens Japanicus. I'm certainly lining up for a copy. I strongly urge you to do so as well. So, clearly, we have a different perspective on robots in the West as opposed to folks in Japan. So, one of the things that we need to note is that the very story which introduced the term robot, and I'll bet somebody here knows what was the first work to introduce the term robot. Somebody? It's actually a Czech stage play from 1920, something which is unpronounceable, Universal Robots. And that very first thing where robots introduced ends up with robots killing all humans. Now, don't take it personally. They're doing it as proletarians throwing over their bourgeoisie overlords. But even so, from that very beginning, there has always been this deep concern about robots in the West. And yet, the Japanese have always tended to consider robots to be basically benign. And to me, this highlights a general lack of distinction in Japan between human machine, between the organic and the inorganic, animate and inanimate, and human and non-human. And in particular, what it highlights is the fact that there is really a rejection of human exceptionalism. One of the themes that runs through a lot of science fiction, certainly Western science fiction, is that somehow human beings are always somehow uniquely different or interesting from all other aliens or other life on this planet or whatever. And Japanese do not really roll that way. For various reasons. So it's worth pausing for a bit to see why that might be. Well, let's start with some cultural perspectives. Begin with belief systems. Animist traditions. From what we used to call Shinto, nowadays we just kind of go with indigenous Japanese beliefs. But basically the notion of kami, spirits, sometimes translated as gods, really exist all around us and inhabit objects, both animate and inanimate. So it doesn't matter if it's a rock or a stone or a tree or a person, all of them have spirits within them. So in this sense, there is really no such thing as a truly inanimate object in Japan. We can also think of it in terms of Buddhist traditions. Who possesses the Buddha nature within themselves? And the Japanese have tended to be, well, for want of a better term, a bit more Catholic when it comes to defining who has the Buddha nature within them. So for these kind of mitigate against hard and fast rules between differentiating what is animate and inanimate, what is human and not. It's also interesting the way that Japanese language makes certain distinctions between things. So in particular, there are two words for thing in Japanese, mono and koto. Mono describes hard, corporeal things, things that have mass. So chairs and human beings and doors and windows and cars, all these things are mono. But there is also that category of thing which is koto, which is incorporeal. Feelings, emotions, aspirations, principles, all these things that exist, have power, but do not have mass as such. There is also a basic distinction in essentially forms of being. Both these words, iru and aru, are to be, and yet iru is reserved solely for sentient living things. So basically people, although it should be noted that robots in Japan are also treated to iru. And aru basically takes care of all the rest. So all other things that are animals, whatnot, these aru. And then the concept of inochi, or life itself. One describes things that are alive as inochi ga aru mono, things corporeal that have life. And once again, inochi is one of those things that is broadly spread. It is not simply human beings, and it can be things like robots, which also possess within them inochi. Then, there are certain social perspectives which also play on this, most notably the concept of the ie, or household. This is a term, it goes back to, obviously to antiquity, has been applied to warrior and other so-called houses in Japan, refers to a certain extent, is kind of coterminous with the family unit, but it highlights the fact that the household has been conceived along corporate rather than familial lines for a long time in Japan. Blood relations are not absolutely required for membership in the ie. One can become a member of the household by association or, more importantly, by adoption. Whereas, for instance, in China, perpetuation of the male bloodline is the absolute key. It is the duty you owe to your ancestors and to your descendants both to perpetuate the male line, and therefore it's got to be that blood tie. This has never been that much of an issue in Japan. That is, the ie can always be perpetuated through adoption. So it doesn't actually require someone to be, biologically related to carry on the ie. So the corporate structure manages to survive rather than the DNA, but that's okay with folks. So all of these things together play a role in shaping basic attitudes that the Japanese have used, and in particular, the Japanese government and corporations are utilizing presently in their pursuit of human form robots. Another interesting way to look at that has been what has the West decided, what are the rules under which robots should operate as opposed to similar rules in Japan. So I'm assuming at least some of you have some familiarity with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. The first of which is a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. And this, Asimov promulgated these back in 1941, and those have been, part of his writings on all his robots since then. He decided in the mid-1980s that there needed to be one more law technically added to this, but since it comes before all the laws, it's technically law 0. So a robot may not harm humanity or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. Now, one of the most important things to note about this particular set of laws is its universal nature. This applies to all robots and all humans. So, any questions on Asimov by any chance? Okay. So, really kind of the popularizer of robots from a fiction standpoint has been Tezuka Osamu. Among other things, he's the creator of Tetsuwan Atom, aka Astro Boy, which some of you may be familiar with. And he, in his work, came up with 10 laws of robotics, the first 5 of which are: robots must serve humankind, robots shall never kill or injure humans, robots shall call the human who creates them father, robots can make anything except money. Now, I don't think that means that robots can't work for a living. I think it does mean that robots can't counterfeit. Robots shall never go abroad without permission. And then laws 6 through 10, male and female robots shall never switch gender roles. Robots shall never change their appearance or assume another identity without permission. Robots created as adults shall never act as children. Robots shall not assemble other robots that have been discarded by humans. And finally, robots shall never damage human homes or tools. So, obviously, not only just the sheer number of laws, but one of the real interesting things here is the very particularistic nature of these laws, and also what does their principal concern seem to be? What is one thing above any other that you can kind of point to that it's concerned about? Yeah.
Robots' proper place in society?
Yeah, it's understanding their proper social roles and limiting themselves to those roles. Certainly not changing them without any, on their own initiative. So maintaining that sort of particularistic nature, their proper social roles, is very important. So when we look at the current state of robots in Japan, what is the current state of things? Well, first of all, we need to know that this is not this was a long time coming. That is, in Japanese society and government circles, there had been a preference for automation over migration to replace a declining number of workers since the 1960s. And you can see this even in things that aren't technically robots. Jido Hanbaiki is basically the Japanese word for vending machines. And it's inconceivable just how many things you can get in a vending machine in Japan. And that begins really in the 1960s, everything from obviously sodas, coffee, tobacco, beer, hard liquor, rice, articles of clothing, various other things. And then, of course, talk about machines for dispensing tickets and various other things. So, you can go through the entire Tokyo subway system or Japan Rail and never actually have to interact with a human being. Although, one of the other things to note about this is that those machines are always going to try and interact with you in a proper Japanese manner. So it will utilize the respectful language. There's, you buy a ticket from the railway machine, there's a little, animated Japanese JR woman who bows to you and does all those things. So it mimics, at least to that extent, that kind of interaction that should take place. When we talk about robots in Japan, obviously it's industrial uses for robots where they really began to pick up steam, this starting in the late 1970s. And by now there are over 250,000 industrial robots in Japan, widely used on production lines. And that's obviously something from Japan that has become commonplace throughout the industrialized world. The robotics industry itself, not just manufacturing robots for industry, and by the way, we are now at a point where robots can manufacture industrial robots, but it's projected to be a $70 billion industry in Japan by the year 2025. And what we are seeing now in kind of this next wave, now that robots are leaving the production line, now that they are going into situations where, among other things, they must interact with human beings in human environments, we see a real preference for so-called embodied intelligence, which means a couple of things. One of them being that the robot should have enough information, enough software, enough computing power to kind of figure out what it needs to do on its own without any real human supervision. So if it's in a household as a caregiver, it should know how to operate in a household as a caregiver. It also means that it should be in a form that makes it comfortable for it to do so. So if your grandma is going to have a caretaker robot in Japan, not only is the caretaker robot going to know how to take care of your grandmother, but it's also going to be of a size and a form, basically a human form that can interact within your grandmother's home, that can communicate with her in proper language, and that is friendly and approachable and therefore is likely to be very cute as well. Now, if you want to get some idea of what the Japanese government is thinking about robots, it's not a bad idea to take a look at the plan called Innovation 25, which was announced by the first cabinet of Shinzo Abe back in February 2007. The current Prime Minister of Japan had a brief one-year stint as Prime Minister from 2006 to 2007. And this was one of the things that they brought out. And the basic idea behind Innovation 25 was to find ways through technology to revitalize the Japanese economy, civil society, and the traditional household. And traditional household, what would you think they were thinking in terms, how would they define traditional household, do you think? How do we define a traditional household? Yeah, exactly. Father's out there as the breadwinner, mother is the housewife, staying home, taking care of the children, all those sorts of things, which is something that Japanese women have for the last 2.5 decades manifestly decided not to do. Made it very clear they have no desire to keep doing that. So investment in technology would be a major key in this Innovation 25 strategy, and robots, of course, would be front and center in that strategy. And obviously, now that we are under the second Abe cabinet, many of the provisions of Innovation 25 are being acted on as government policy. So the question is, what drives this urgency? Why is it so important for Japan to be out in front of this as social policy, this creation of robots? And the short answer is demographics. Japan has a declining population. House pets currently outnumber children in Japanese households. And it's not a small gap. It's roughly 22 million versus 16.6 million. If current estimates go by 2050, 40% of Japan's population will be over the age of 65. By the way, if the population of Japan is currently just under 127 million. If trends continue as they go, the government would be very happy if by 2050, and that's 35 years from now, the population of Japan is at 100 million. There are projections that it could be down to 80. So obviously, we have a tremendous number of people who are going to require a great deal of daily care and attention, much more so that a population which presumably is out there working can do. Therefore, you're going to need some kind of caregiving, although surveys routinely demonstrate that 80% of Japanese would prefer a robot caregiver than a foreign human. Primarily because, there is a reason why we use the ATMs and not the tellers. There's a reason why we order things online or do email or text rather than talk. Human interactions can be troubling and problematic, and this is one of the things that drives that. So this obviously is leading to a tremendous boom and investment, not just of government funds, but also of corporate funds into the creation of so-called companion robots. That is, robots that can live in the household, take care of daily chores, make sure your grandma takes her medicine, pick her up if she falls, if she's injured, call the police or the hospital, do all those things that people who are old and infirm require on a daily basis. And the basic idea is that companion robots will be able to do these things because humans can attain emotional comfort and care from robots and can relate to them as familiar and reassuring interlocutors because they are human-formed and basically cute and appealing. So an author of a recent book in Japan called Living with Robots has created their own 3 laws. And these are the so-called 3 laws of Robo-LDK. LDK is an abbreviation for, you look at apartment listings, living room, dining room, kitchen. So now you'll have Robo living room, dining room, kitchen in Japan. So the 3 laws, I think, say a lot about the aspirations of Japan when it comes to integrating robots into their society. Law 1, robots must be useful to humans and provide protection, caregiving, and attend to their spiritual and psychological needs. On the idea that this is the most useful things that robots can do for people. Law 2, robots must be able to interact with and relate to humans in a reassuring manner. That is, people need to feel safe with robots. A robot's body conforms to its function and role in the household. As a physical body living in close proximity to humans, robots must be able to exercise law 1 and 2. So they must embody the things, or they must embody in themselves kind of the space and the function. They must fit, basically form must follow function. They must be able to interact in human ways within a human household. Now, the question of why do Japanese, and in particular the Japanese government, feel the need to devote such vast resources to creating non-human solutions to issues which many societies would deal with through either increased immigration, encouraging greater female participation in the workforce, or providing more generous social supporting infrastructure. So there is obviously a hidden agenda here. And once again, it goes back to this notion of kind of reinforcing the traditional household. So women don't want to have children because raising children is tedious and time-consuming. Well, robots can raise your children. So therefore, there is no longer any need to defer having them. By taking the drudgery out of married life, robots can allow for married life to continue. They can handle housework and looking after kids and all that sort of thing. And if women really want to work, they can telecommute. Which means that certainly the Japanese government, and to a larger extent, but not exclusively, Japanese society, is looking at robots as a new version of adopted members of the EA. And very much considering or contemplating or conceiving of the Japanese home as kind of the traditional EA with its traditional gender roles intact. Husband is outside doing the work and providing for the household. Women are inside and maintaining the household. So robots can now be brought into the household as members of the EA. And because there is this desire to incorporate robots within the EA, there has been a move in Japan, and Jennifer Robertson has really interesting work on this, to give basically robots rights within the household, which means it's entirely possible that in Japan there will be rights for robots before there are rights for so-called Zainichi Koreans, that is, descendants of Korean populations living in Japan, or other non-Japanese immigrants living in Japan. Robots will have fuller access to Japanese legal protections than will other non-Japanese humans living in Japan. So one of the things that this helps to point out is just how persistent structures and power and authority can be in Japan despite tremendous change in social evolution. And so this is just one example I think it nicely illustrates the principle. This is from the book by Sakio Komatsu, Japan Sinks, wherein Japan sinks into the ocean. But the series, so realizing that Japan is about to disappear under the ocean, the government has to put together a plan, obviously, to evacuate the Japanese. And at an original a meeting where the opposition politicians are being briefed, one of them says, "It seems to me that you gentlemen, while giving lip service to the worth of human life, have in fact been most concerned with planning for the continuance of the financial and industrial life of this nation itself and its structure, rather than the people. Rather than individual men and women, it's the nation and its structure that are more precious to you." And I think this is definitely, to a certain extent, what is happening in Japan now at government levels when they think about how to deal with this crisis. I can assure you that Japanese young women have no desire to become housewives served by robots. They want to actually take more part in the workforce. Young people generally, and this is another thing we'll be talking about a little bit tomorrow during my talk, is they are finding all manner of ways to carve out meaningful lives for themselves that have nothing to do with preserving any structures that the government is interested in preserving. That's causing a great deal of anxiety in Japan these days. So structures are going to try and persist despite change. Now, what's important why it's important to, I think, keep abreast of what's happening in Japan is, like industrial robots, these other new technologies are unlikely to remain confined to Japan. And frankly, that is the issue which keeps me up at night. Scientists, engineers, marketers, or potential consumers are generally unable to think through the implications of these new technologies. The thinking of legal and regulatory authorities often operates considerably behind the curve of technological change. And it's for this reason, if no other, that the humanities really needs to remain the essential component of any education. We can always count on the imagination of artists and writers to provide at least some glimpse of where continuing blithely down the road of human-form robots with autonomous software may actually lead us. Now, certainly on the Western side of things, The array of works looking at these sorts of questions is vast, and it goes from The Legend of the Golem and Frankenstein's Monster to the reboot of the TV series Battlestar Galactica, or Person of Interest, which I would actually submit is the most current, thoughtful American rumination on the perils of AI. If we wish to find the best illustration of the implications of the pursuit of this technology from the Japanese side of things, we could do no better than examining the 2002-2004 anime series Ghost in the Shell, standalone complex directed by Kamiyama Kenji. I know many of you might be familiar with this title, but I'm actually confining my remarks to the two original anime series, not the original manga, which is also available in English, or the two full-length films that served as the basis for the series. So GITS, as the show's title can charmingly be abbreviated, unfolds in the Japanese capital city of Nihama. Without going into too much detail, it appears that as a result of the Fourth World War, along with some major geopolitical restructuring, the center of gravity of Japan, particularly politically as well as economically, has shifted well to the south. Exactly what has become of Tokyo was never actually explained, but is kind of left to your imagination. Now, a notable thing about this rather dire-seeming future is that its setting is not actually overtly post-apocalyptic. Sure, there are some areas outside the city which are run down and abandoned, and a large squatter city of refugees called Dejima exists in view of the city, but in general, the Japan portrayed in Ghost in the Shell is the urban Japan of the good old bubble economy, hyper-modern and under the firm control of a triad of bureaucrats, corporate flacks, and tame politicians. What's most changed about this setting is the Japanese themselves. Having taken their penchant for hypermodernity to extremes, we are left to ponder what they have become. And what the series Ghost in the Shell allows us to see is what happens when the line between man and machine is not so much blurred as entirely obliterated. One of these people is a human, and the other is not. Did you guess this one? These people are humans. These people are not humans. And what these people are, I got no idea. Now, I will admit that my feelings about Ghost in the Shell are more than a little ambivalent. On the surface, it would seem to have everything you'd want in an anime series. The quality of the animation is top-notch. There's an excellent voice cast. Even the English dub isn't too bad. It features a kick-ass musical score by Kano Yoko. You heard some of it before we started here. And, after all, its main character is a sexy female cyborg who makes interesting wardrobe choices. However, the series as a whole is unbearably talky. There's an entire episode in the first series that takes place literally inside an internet chat room. Much of this talk is designed to be deep and philosophical, but even in Japanese tends to be more tedious and shallow. And the most interesting thing to note is what the producers of the show wax philosophical about, and what they actually choose to pass without comment. So Ghost posits a future where human brains can be cyberized, that is fitted with computer processors that allow them to network wirelessly or otherwise, just as computers do. Unfortunately, this makes the human brain just as vulnerable to hacking or appropriation as any computer. At the same time, human bodies can be partially or entirely cyborged, replaced by mechanical prosthetics which give them advanced strength, speed, visual acuity, or any number of other enhancements. And the hero of the show, Major Kusanagi Motoko, inhabits an entirely prosthetic body and has done so since she was 6 years old. Meanwhile, the development of artificial intelligence, AI, has advanced to the stage where computer programs have become capable of functioning entirely autonomously and can mimic human thought and emotions. Now completely digitized, human consciousness and artificial intelligence can be loaded into any mechanical device, from crude robots to sophisticated androids with sufficient memory to hold them, or can basically be free-floating in the cloud. So the divide between humans and non-humans cannot be determined by physical characteristics. Instead, the divide is established along spiritual lines. Humans possess ghosts, and other mechanical devices possess AIs. So what separates Major Kusanagi from the AI ladies she works with and superficially resembles is the fact that she has a ghost and they have software. Or is it actually that simple? Over the course of the series, the Tachikomas, these small robot tanks with their own AIs, seem to evolve their own capacity for individual identity and sense of self. Major Kusanagi is initially alarmed by this development and has them booted out of Section 9, the unit she works for, but in the final crisis of the first season, they demonstrate a capacity for initiative and also loyalty and self-sacrifice, which convinces her that they should be part of the team again. And at the end of the second season, they actually do sacrifice themselves nobly, which seems to have given them essentially a artificial intelligence afterlife. So what we're left with here is distinctions between machines with AIs and machines with ghosts, which make no meaningful difference. Now, as I alluded to before, the series goes on at great but quite superficial length about the nature of networked consciousness. And indeed, the very idea of the standalone complex seems to refer to the ability to generate an original thought and keep it in what has essentially become a hive mind. But analysis of the show can potentially tell us a lot about the role of technology on Japan's future and what it may bring us. And it's not for nothing that a proposed sequel to the original film, Ghost in the Shell, was titled Man-Machine Interface. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Ghost in the Shell is the entirely unproblematic way it portrays a society populated by the mix of wired and non-wired, augmented and non-augmented humanity, living side by side with autonomous and often indistinguishable machines. This allows us to show what happens when the Japanese, taking this penchant for hypermodernity to extremes, obliterate the line between man and machine. If nothing else, one of the virtues of this series is that it makes it very plain that turning the human brain into a large hard drive with a high-speed internet connection is simply a terrible idea. Such wired human beings become just as vulnerable to hacking or appropriation as any computer. Now, obviously, criminals have no scruples in this regard, but neither do the authorities. The concept that something like a warrant might be necessary or desirable before invading an individual's brain, especially without any form of informed consent, simply does not enter into the picture in this series. Indeed, this issue is far more disturbing than a mere question of systemic civil rights violations by the state. This sort of unwanted, intimate penetration of the individual without consent might well be conceived as a new form of rape. The series also manages to treat the transformation of Japan's human population into one divided between augmented and non-augmented in an equally unproblematic way. First, it is notable that the only people who appear to object either to cyberization or augmentation of human beings are portrayed as marginalized extremists. The practical consequences of a population split by a mechanical divide between ordinary, unmodified humans and cyborgs with enhanced physical abilities, strength, endurance, ability to read digital material, but also possessing special dietetic and other needs. Cyborgs don't float, so they can't swim, it turns out. None of these things is ever seriously examined. More seriously, this transformation of humanity brings with it numerous implications regarding what it means to be an individual human being that are simply ignored. What are the legal implications of this form of existence? What are the moral and ethical dilemmas exposed? What are the spiritual implications, not least of which is practical immortality, since you can always be downloaded into a new cyborg body, of being so transformed? So what Ghost in the Shell provides us is a critical text that can drive a conversation on the present and future implications of this technology by highlighting cultural differences between Japan and the West, as well as the various issues raised by the existence of such a society. It also provides opportunities to stimulate inquiry into the implications of current trends in the development of all three technologies: artificial intelligence, human-form robotics, and human enhancement. Now, if you would like to continue this conversation in a slightly cooler setting, let me point out that the UAA Montgomery-Dixon Center for Japanese Language and Culture, the Department of Philosophy and its Ethics Center, and the Department of History are putting out a call for papers for cyber ethics, an interdisciplinary conference for faculty, students, and others on the ethical and cultural aspects of artificial intelligence and robotics, focusing on Japan. The conference will examine why Japan represents the crest of the wave in robotics, what is the current state of technological development and adoption, what does the future hold, and what are its practical, ethical, moral, legal, cultural, and social implications. And our hope is to create an ongoing dialogue and process for examination of and education about these issues. I should point out that Anchorage is actually quite nice in February, and if this winter is anything like last winter, it might very well be warmer in February in Anchorage than it is here. So I look forward to perhaps continuing this conversation with you at another time, but for now, I'm very happy to take your questions. So thank you. Yeah.
So, after looking at your presentation, it kind of seems that, I mean, and I don't want to say that Japan specifically is thinking that this is the future, but it seems the situation seems to direct to that future. So, is this just a result of a kind of like a nihilist view of humanity? Like, humanity is not good enough to keep moving things forward, so we need artificial people to come and take over or something? Because to me, it's like, it doesn't matter how fancy you make a robot. I mean, we'll never have the humanity as you explained. I mean,
well, once again, that is a very strong part of the Western cultural perspective on robots, and yet, once again, Japanese, for various reasons, don't really make that hard distinction between animate and inanimate, sentient and insentient. So for many, it is just essentially adding another member of the household. So, and that, to a certain extent, is the real problem. It's not so much that Japanese and Western conceptions of this conflict. What I think about is one of the problems that we in the West tend to have when we think about robots is that robots, especially intelligent robots with life and self-awareness, would ultimately aspire to be us. And that actually is equally unrealistic. Whatever is created by artificial intelligence will aspire to be it, the best it can be. And the problem is maybe that requires our presence and maybe not. So it's interesting to note that in Japan, it's the mechanical side of things that really does tend to be a bit more cutting edge. The actual work in terms of artificial intelligence and software tends to be a bit more elevated, a bit more cutting edge in the West. But the minute the Japanese have human-form robots that you can plug this thing into, they will, without hesitation. And therefore, that's why our machine overlords are going to be in the form of Hello Kitty robots, because the technological capability will come from Japan, the software will come from the outside, the mix of the two. That's the thing that worries me. I don't know if that answered your question, but I don't see it necessarily as an essentially, it might be from a Western perspective, it is not from a Japanese one. Andrew.
Is this attitude towards robots specifically Japanese, or is this happening in other countries, or do you know?
It's,
what's that company that makes walking robots? It's like awesome.
There are other places here that are doing similar things, but once again, the kind of unease that pervades our look at robots, unless they're robots, so the movie that came out a few months ago, Chappie, as long as they aspire to be us, then it's okay. If they're just kind of better versions than us, then it's okay. If they want to be anything other than us, then that's where kind of problems ensue from kind of the Western perspective. So, Korea has a demographic problem, in many ways even worse than Japan. The Korean government is not investing billions of dollars in the creation of human form robots. They may buy some from Japan, but that's not one of the ways they choose to go. Other advanced industrial societies throughout Europe are doing that. They prefer human solutions. And there are many ways in which you can deal with a demographic crisis, like encouraging female participation in the workforce, making it possible for people to work longer, having kind of retired people have kind of second careers, and many other things, and of course immigration. But that is not in the cards for Japan.
So where are we on the curve of the uncanny valley?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
So how human are these critters going to become?
So the basic, so yes. So the question is how far on the curve, how human are they? It varies from, so for instance, SoftBank, the company SoftBank, last summer introduced a kind of base human form robot. So it has a head and a neck and arms and a torso. It actually doesn't have legs. It kind of rolls around on things. But the basic idea, more important than the mechanical part of it, it has an open software system that people are encouraged to tinker with, to help build its capacity to interact with human beings and thereby push forward the design of human beings. And it retails for about $2,000. So if you want to start, kind of work on your own human form robot, you can get one of these and actually start, tinkering with its software. Others are, arms, legs, heads, hands, can manipulate, can carry things, and that's, partly driven by the need to be able to interact in a human environment, to be able to, help grandma to get into and out of the tub and various other things. Some are very creepily human. And those are kind of being set up as kind of receptionists at hotels and doctors' offices and other things like that, and they are really creepy. So we are not at the stage where you can get basically something that you would call an android. That is something that looks, sounds, interacts just as a human would. We're not there for many, many reasons, mechanically, in terms of the software, and just the ability to kind of mimic human behavior. Yeah.
So, with the robots raising the children, is there absolutely no concern for how that will affect future generations?
That is an interesting question. And I keep going back to a short story where basically, the child is raised by the mechanical bear, basically, which is always kind of telling him what to do. And so, yeah, at one point, it's how exactly is the robot raising the child? What sort of socialization is it giving the child? Basically, so presumably, the robot is not thinking of this on its own, so it's been programmed to socialize the child in a particular way. Who gets to decide exactly what kind of input do the parents get into how the robot socializes the child? These are all questions that maybe some people are thinking about, but quite possibly not. Yeah? I would be very surprised if this happened in Japan. What I could definitely see is robot firefighters. So people to go and inspect places like Fukushima Daiichi in the form of robots. So people doing those sorts of routinely dangerous things may very well find themselves replaced by robots. But for various reasons having to do with Japan's past, obviously, and they've done some reconfiguration of their self-defense forces and various other things that have garnered a lot of public ire in Japan. So I don't see them going down that way. That doesn't mean, however, that others can't down the road. And when you think of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, pilotless airplanes, various other things, bomb disposal, all manner of things. So that technology is definitely going to go forward. Yeah.
Sorry.
No?
So, are they only interested in their own country and their homeland, or are they interested in space too?
Not really. So one of the things that comes up a lot in discussions about Japan these days is how much discussions about what Japanese society is or ought to be is really kind of confined to Japan. It's not really concerned about, it's basically concerned about finding the solution in-house. It's not really looking to solve the problems by making Japan a much more integrated part of the world with a much more worldly, if one might say, diverse population. And there's actually a term that's come up for this Galapagos Syndrome. The fact that a lot of things in Japan seem to be made really for the consumption of the Japanese, and if it's useful somewhere else, that's nice, but if it's not, well, Japan's a nice big market, so we can still make money, and it's okay. So think of cell phones. Does anyone here have a cell phone made in Japan? You probably have some Korean ones or some manufactured in China, but Japan is where mobile apps started. Japan is where cell phones really came to be. But they did it on a uniquely Japanese system, which worked fine in Japan, but was not really exportable. And therefore, they really missed the boat of mobile devices and all the rest of that. And they don't really seem to be terribly broken up about that. Japan remains a sufficiently large market, and so as long as it works for the Japanese, that's fine with them. Yeah.
You said earlier in the talk that robots would have more rights than Koreans. Why does a robot have rights?
In particular, it seems to have to do with a desire not to be seen as exploiting robots, and also to make sure that they have kind of the same standing within the household as any. So first of all, one of the things that's to note is that your legal identity in Japan is established by your registration in the family register, which is usually kept by the government, the koseki, which is usually kept by the government. So when you get married, you go down to the county ward office and you say, hey, we're married as a couple, so that's, your family register is updated to show that. It's one of the least romantic places to get married. If you're really into getting married in an unromantic way, Japan is the perfect place. So just go down to the ward office and register as a married couple, and that's done. Children, they're entered on the family register, and the idea here is, essentially robots would be registered on the family register in much the same way as anybody else, which is something that currently and would obviously have the benefits of citizenship in a way that folks descended from people who are of Korean descent and various other immigrant populations do not have complete access to. So once again, Jennifer Robertson, who I'm happy to say is coming up to the Cyber Ethics Conference, has done a lot of work on this. And it's really fascinating how deep the rabbit hole goes.
So what would be their standing before the law?
They would be, I presume so. They would be considered subject to the law, but also protected by the law. So, last question?
Are there any safety precautions that are being put in place aside from these laws and whatnot that could, same way that you can't just really go buy a gun, there's certain background checks in the US and stuff like that.
I presume that in the development phase, there is a fair amount of government regulation. I don't know what kind of regulatory systems exist in terms of operating software, in terms of, okay, you have demonstrated that your companion robot can handle all the autonomous duties that it needs to take care of your grandma. Is it possible that, is there someone who's checking safeties say that suddenly it won't decide to kill grandma. I don't know. And I strongly suspect that they aren't, because no one has conceived of the possibility of it happening yet, in many respects. So thank you very much.